Lily, come here. Come here. Lily, come on. Do I have to get you a TREAT to get you over here? Happy Friday, Baylor College of Medicine and friends of Baylor. Well, first of all, Janet, don't worry. There won't be that much science this week. I know you hated it, but what are you going to do? So first I want to do is talk a little bit about what's going on in the world, because it's really, really fascinating. The big outbreak right now is really in Japan and China, even though they're not reporting it. This is interesting. These are the numbers from Japan. Huge spikes in Japan. This is where the United States was back in March of 2022, but Japan is now just as high. And the funny thing, if you'll recall, Prime Minister Suga was asked to step down because of this little itty-bitty spike right there. That was the Olympics. And remember, Japan was sort of on a lockdown, like China, nobody in, nobody out. And they had the Olympians come in and had a spike, and Prime Minister Suga was asked to step down. Well, Prime Minister Kishida comes in, says, well, let's open everything up because the economy's bad, and all these giant spikes, but he's being rewarded as a hero for bringing the economy back. So I don't know. I feel a little bad for Suga. But it's the same thing in China. I mean, it's really kind of fascinating. We can't really get any insight into China because right now, if you look at the reporting, they're not even reporting their numbers. Nobody believes them. But if you look at everything around China, I've just expanded that heat map. Japan's the hottest, South Korea, Taiwan, but Hong Kong and Taiwan also very, very high. You can assume mainland China is also in the midst of a giant surge of cases. And if you put together, I'm not being political here, but you put together the one-child policy that China had for decades, which really has led China to be one of the oldest countries. The average age is older than in the United States. And then you combine that with the zero COVID policy, what basically left China with a very large elderly susceptible population because their vaccine rates weren't very good. One of the reasons Japan's having a big surge is because Japan didn't do a good job of vaccinating their people either. So if you do a zero COVID policy and you have an elderly population that you don't vaccinate, that leads to trouble, and that's what's happening right now. Now, from our perspective, or for anybody, just thinking about the world and the coronavirus, we need to get those people vaccinated. Whether you like China or not, we need all places that are poorly vaccinated to be vaccinated. Africa, where the problem is getting delivery, but China, where it was political problem, we need to get all people who are susceptible vaccinated. Otherwise, we will be dealing with that issue I talked about last week, which is the world doesn't behave as a homogeneous population. And instead of having the COVID pandemic spike and then go down, we keep feeding susceptible people into the pool. Just like with that continuous culture analogy, we keep taking people who are susceptible and bringing them into the pool so the virus can infect them, and that just keeps feeding this pandemic. Had everyone been exposed together at the same time, it would be much better now. But unfortunately, that's what we're dealing with. So what's going on in the United States? Very interesting. Cases are flat, but case reporting is very inaccurate, so we've been following hospitalizations. Test positivity has been coming down. Nationally, hospitalizations are beginning to fall. They're down 14%. This is actually the trends in case number. You can see they're flat. This is the heat map for case number. It appears that mostly it's in the Carolinas now and in the Northeast a bit. You can see this is where we were in November 18th. Southeast really not involved, but over the last 2 weeks, you've seen the growth in cases along the Atlantic coast, the Carolinas particularly, in Mississippi and in New York City. As I mentioned, hospitalizations, though, are coming down 22%. So you can see this giant fall in hospitalizations. Even in the over 70-year-old group, hospitalizations are down. Now, deaths, in contrast, are up. And so deaths are up almost 70%. And again, that's the way it works. People get infected, It takes a few weeks for them to get severely infected and be in the hospital. And those that are hospitalized, some will recover, but the ones that don't recover go on to die. And so deaths are a very lagging indicator. But all in all, if you look at the leading indicators, hospitalizations being down and then deaths being up, I think we're beginning to see coming out of it. Now, if you look at nationally, again, I showed this last week, but I'll show it again. Deaths are up. I assume they will peak, much like this peak happened in July. We will begin to see a peak in deaths, and that will start to come down. The best news of all is if you look at wastewater surveillance, there has been a really dramatic drop in wastewater total viral burden. And that is the best indicator that we will continue to see a fall in cases. If you look at, it's hard to see it on each red dot represents a wastewater surveillance site reporting positive. Last week it was hotter, a little bit less hot this week. That's not so obvious. But look at New York City. All the red dots are hot. It's now down to orange. So even New York City is beginning to fall. And I will show you our wastewater data is beginning to fall as well. Now, what's driving the virus right now? It's I had mentioned XBB1 last week as being dominant in the Northeast. XBB1 now is the dominant in terms of total amounts of viral variant. It accounts for 43% of all the variants. That's the dark blue bar here. And remember, the XBB 1.5 was originally isolated in Singapore, and the BQ11 and BQ1 isolated in the UK, they're beginning to fall. Again, this points out that these variants develop anywhere in the world, so it's important that we vaccinate and get as much of the world resistant as possible. Here's the buckyball examples of what's the dominant variants. You can see the dark blue is the XBB, and that one is highest. It was last week in New York City and New England. It's now higher in the Atlantic coast too. But in the rest of the country, BQQ, BQ1, those UK variants still are the dominant ones. So you know it's moving from the East Coast towards the West Coast. It's the dominant strain, but it's slowly but surely taking over from BQ. Now, what's going on in Texas? It's about the same, little bit increase. We're moderate risk in our friends in Dimmitt County, moderate risk in Harris County. Our case rate is down from last week slightly, 107 from 117. Our hospital admissions are down from 16 per 100,000 to 13. Case rate's about the same in Dimmitt County. If you look at our data from the Texas Medical Center, our positivity rate has dropped from hospitalized patients from 11.8 to 11.1%. As I mentioned, our hospitalizations are also down, reflecting the same thing that's going on in the United States, down from a peak at, I think it was about 160, it's down to 146. And this is, again, the best news of all. Look at our wastewater data finally beginning to plateau, which means that cases will begin to come down. So, I mean, overall, the good news is I think we're actually through most of the problem. I was very concerned we would have a prolonged COVID outbreak, but it looks like it has peaked and is beginning to come down. Combine that with the flu data, influenza data, really peaked in December, but it's really coming down now. Influenza A, mostly in the red and orange and yellow are influenza A. Very little influenza B this season. And also RSV is dropping. So you see RSV peaked about November, but has dropped dramatically. This is the last year's RSV, which was sort of flat for the whole time. This is this year's RSV, this early peak, but drop. So I hate to say it, it looks like good news. I mean, no matter how you look at it. COVID numbers are dropping, hospitalizations are dropping, RSV is dropping, influenza is dropping. So I think we have a pretty decent spring ahead of us. Of course, the big question is in those areas of the world where China in particular, parts of Africa, where those variants emerge, where there's a lot of replication, we never know. So we'll just have to wait and see. But right now, things are looking pretty good for the spring. I want to end today with a couple of shout-outs. First of all, congratulations to Erez Lieberman-Aden, the Associate Professor in Molecular and Human Genetics, who's being honored by the Texas Academy of Medicine, Engineering, Science, and Technology with the Edith and Peter O'Donnell Award in the Physical Sciences. his work is very fascinating. It's on the genomic 3D structure of DNA and how that influences regulation. Really exciting science, and he's a real leader in the field. I also want to mention that Baylor, once again, is a sponsor of the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. In addition to having our own chuck wagon, which is always my favorite thing at the rodeo, we're also sponsoring Rodeo Radio, which is on Houston Station 93Q. We'll have a bunch of advertisements for Baylor, but also several of our physicians will be interviewed. So we may not be good at football, but we are great at rodeo. So look, check it out. And finally, welcome Lily back. Lily is back in town after her week sabbatical, spending time in North Carolina, helping introduce our newest addition to the family, Louie. Louie's awesome. We'll have a little video of Louie because he's so much fun. Anyway, Louie, welcome to the family. Anyway, have a great weekend, and I can't wait to see you next week.